Some minds do not quiet easily. They do not need less. They need something precise enough to follow. The archive offers not an answer, but a structure, a place for thought to move more slowly. The door has closed. The room is dark, not gradually, not by degrees, but as the immediate consequence of the door meeting the frame. Whatever light was present in the corridor, in the space outside, has been cut from this room at the line where the door fits the wall. The room is the same room it was a moment ago. The surfaces are in their positions. The air is the same air. The geometry has not changed. What has changed is the light that was reaching the surfaces and reaching the eye. There is still some light here, not from a source. No lamp is on, no window is uncovered. But the absolute removal of light is not what darkness is in a room like this one. The walls have a surface temperature and emit radiation in the infrared, invisible. The gap at the base of the door admits a narrow brightness from the corridor, spreading along the floor a few centimeters before falling below the level the eye can use. The eye is open. The surfaces of the room are present. The information that would allow the room to be read is not currently arriving in sufficient quantity for the receiving surface to answer. The eye is in the room it cannot yet see. Before the door closed, the eye was in a lit corridor. The surfaces there were reflecting light. The overhead fixture casting its spectrum onto the floor, the walls, the door at the end, the light bouncing between surfaces and arriving at the eye from all directions. The eye was receiving far more than it needed. In bright conditions, the receiving surface of the eye contains a mechanism for managing this excess. The color-sensitive cells near the center, dense and precise, were active, responding to the quantity and spectrum of the light arriving, sending signals at the rate the brightness required. But in that brightness, something else was happening. The molecules in the rod cells, the cells distributed across the wider surface of the retina, the cells that operate at the edge of vision, the cells built for low light, were being changed by the light arriving in excess of what they required. A molecule that can receive light and respond to it was, under that illumination, being converted into a form that cannot, not destroyed, converted. The light was doing to the molecule what light does when it arrives in large quantity, changing its shape, separating its components, leaving the rod cell holding the changed form rather than the form that answers. The eye entered this dark room in that condition. The rod cells carrying their changed molecules entered a space where the light was almost nothing, and because the molecules were in their changed form, the threshold, the minimum light required to produce a response, was high. More light than this room contains would be needed to cross it. The eye was present in the room. The room's faint light was arriving at the retina. The retina was not yet able to answer. This is not a failure of the room. The room contains what it contains. The faint brightness at the base of the door is a real quantity of light. Photons arriving at a measurable rate, striking the surface of the retina, carrying the information that the geometry of the room would allow a sensitive enough surface to receive. The room is offering what it has. The receiving surface is not yet in a state to accept it. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. Breath enters. breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. In some minutes after the door closes, something begins. In the rod cells, the molecule that was changed by the light in the corridor begins to return. Not quickly. The process that converts the changed form back to the form that can receive light is slow, dependent on the enzymes that work at the pace the cell's chemistry allows, proceeding at a rate that cannot be hurried by attention or intention or the desire to see. The cell does what it does at the rate it does it. The molecule moves back toward the state in which it can answer. The threshold begins to move, not visibly, not in any way the eye can observe about itself. The threshold is a quantity, the minimum light required to produce a signal. And as the molecules return to their receiving state, that quantity decreases. The rod cells that a few minutes ago required more light than this room contains are beginning to require less. Some of them have crossed back far enough that the faint light arriving from the gap beneath the door is now sufficient to reach them. The outline of the door appears, not fully, a suggestion, the geometry implied rather than stated, the edge of the door against the wall barely distinguishable from the wall itself. The eye is not receiving the door as it would appear in full light. It is receiving the minimum information that allows the door's position to be inferred. The light carrying this information was already in the room. It was already arriving at the retina. The retina, a few minutes ago, could not answer it. Now some of the rod cells can. What appeared is not new light. The room has not changed. The gap beneath the door is the same gap, emitting the same quantity of light it was emitting when the door first closed. What has changed is the receiving surface. A portion of it has returned to a state sensitive enough to detect the light that was already present and not previously detectable. The door became visible because the eye became able to receive less. The cone cells in the center of the retina adapted faster. Within the first minutes, the color-sensitive cells near the fovea, the center of sharp focus, the region of high density, returned to a usable state. Their molecules also undergo change in bright light, also return in the dark, but the process for the cone cells runs faster. By 5 minutes, most of the cone cells have returned to a sensitivity sufficient to operate in what light there is. By 7 minutes, they have reached close to their best condition for this level of illumination. But cone cells require more light than this room contains. Their threshold, even fully recovered, sits above what the room is offering. The faint light at the floor, the dim edge of the door, the almost imperceptible difference between the dark wall and the slightly darker space of the open doorway. None of this reaches the quantity the cone cells need. The cone cells have returned to their best state and still cannot answer this room. The rod cells are still working. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The rod cells require more than an hour to reach their full sensitivity. Their molecules return more slowly. The process that rebuilds them from the changed form to the receiving form proceeds at the pace the cell's biochemistry sets. Not faster because the room is dark, not slower because the room is dark, but at the rate that the conditions of the cell and the availability of the materials the process requires together determine. The rod cells do not know the eye wants to see. They rebuild at their rate. At 20 minutes, the rod cells are considerably more sensitive than they were at 5 minutes. Not at their maximum. That will not be reached for another 20 minutes at least. And even that estimate depends on how much light the eye was exposed to before entering the room, how much the molecules were changed, how far they have to travel back, but considerably more sensitive than they were. The threshold has moved. More of the room is now available to the eye than was available at 5 minutes. The molecule at the center of this is rhodopsin, a protein and a smaller molecule bound together in the rod cell in a configuration that allows it to absorb light. When a photon of the right energy arrives, it changes the smaller molecule's shape, a change that propagates through the protein, triggering the signal the rod cell sends. In bright light, more photons arrive than the rhodopsin can process, and the changed form accumulates faster than it can return. In darkness, with no photons arriving, the changed form slowly converts back. The rhodopsin reassembles from the components the light separated. This is what the dark room is doing to the eye, not acting on it directly. The dark room is not producing the recovery. The dark room is the absence of what was interrupting the recovery. In the absence of the light that was driving the molecules into their changed state, the process that returns them to their receiving state can proceed without being reversed. The recovery is the cell's own process. The room's role is to stop interfering with it. The room has not changed enough to explain what is now visible. 20 minutes after the door closed, the shapes in the room are available. The corner where the wall meets the wall, the edge of the shelf, the form of the chair. None of these are brightly visible. No line is sharp, no color is present. Only the spatial relationships between surfaces and the faint differences in how much light each surface holds. But they are present in a way they were not present at minute 1 or minute 5. The room is the same room. The light is the same light. The gap beneath the door is the same gap, emitting the same quantity of light it emitted from the moment the door closed. The walls hold the same faint radiation they have held throughout. The chair is in its position. The shelf is in its position. Not one surface has moved. Not one surface has brightened. What the room contains has remained constant from the instant the door met the frame. The change is in the receiving surface. The rod cells that were not answering at minute 1 are answering now. Not because more light is arriving. The same light has been arriving continuously, because the threshold those cells require has moved below the quantity the room contains. The light was always sufficient. The cells were not yet in the state to be sufficient for it. The room did not become brighter. The eye became able to receive less. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The rod cells have not finished. At 30 minutes, the threshold is still moving. The recovery of rhodopsin is still proceeding at the rate the cell's process allows. More of the molecules that were changed in the corridor have returned to the form that can answer. The threshold, the minimum quantity of light the rod cells require before they signal, is still decreasing. The full sensitivity of the rod cells, the state in which they can respond to the smallest quantity of light the eye is capable of detecting, has not yet been reached. It will take longer still. The exact duration depends on how bright the corridor was, how long the eye was in it, how far the molecules were driven from their receiving state. A brief exposure in moderate light requires less recovery than a long exposure in bright light. The rod cells in this eye, in this room, are somewhere in that range, still descending toward the threshold that represents their full capacity, still incorporating the return molecules into a receiving surface that grows more sensitive with each one that completes its return. The shapes in the room are more present than they were at 20 minutes, not sharper. The rod cells do not produce sharp images. Their signals are pooled across wide areas of the retina. The spatial resolution they offer is coarse compared to what the cone cells provide in good light, but more present in the sense that the threshold has moved further. That light which was insufficient to produce a signal at 20 minutes is now sufficient, that the room's faint offering is being received by a surface that has become better calibrated to receive it. The room is unchanged. The wall is where it was. The shelf is where it was. The chair holds its position in the space. The gap beneath the door emits the same narrow light it emitted from the moment the door closed. None of the surfaces have moved toward the eye. None have brightened. The room is holding what it has always held in this darkness. The receiving surface is what has changed. The threshold does not announce its position. It is not experienced as a number, not perceived as a line being crossed. What the eye experiences is the appearance of the room, surfaces becoming available, edges separating from the spaces beside them, the geometry of the room arriving in the signal as it crosses the threshold the rod cells currently hold. Each increment of recovery is a fraction of a degree in the minimum detectable, producing no single moment of revelation, but a continuous, slow arrival of what was always present in the room and not yet receivable. The room was always here. The light it contains was always arriving at the retina. The retina was arriving at the capacity to receive it. Molecule by molecule, rod cell by rod cell, the changed forms returning to the receiving forms at the rate the cell's own process determines, indifferent to the darkness surrounding it, indifferent to the eye's desire to see, proceeding because the conditions for proceeding are present and nothing is preventing them. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The dark room holds its geometry. The surfaces have not moved. The distances between them are what they were when the eye entered with its diminished sensitivity and found the room illegible. The chair is the same distance from the wall. The shelf carries the same objects in the same positions. The gap beneath the door admits the same light. Nothing in the room required the eye to recover before offering itself. The room was offering itself continuously, from the moment the door closed, at whatever level of detail the receiving surface could accept. What the eye receives now is not different from what was available at the first minute. It is the same light, the same surfaces, the same spatial relationships. What is different is the surface receiving it, a surface that has been returning in the dark to a state in which less is enough. Less light, less signal, less than the threshold that the brightness of the corridor had required before the room could be read. The rod cells are still recovering. The threshold is still moving downward. The minimum light required has not reached its lowest point. The room is still becoming more available. Not because the room is changing, but because the receiving surface is still changing. The process of return still proceeding at the rate the cell's chemistry allows, still adding to the sensitivity that the previous minutes have already built. At some point, the process will reach its limit. The molecules that can return will have returned. The threshold will have descended to the level the rod cells are capable of reaching. After that, the dark room will not become more available. What cannot be seen at that point will not become visible with further recovery. The limit is set by the cells, by the quantity of rhodopsin they can hold, by the sensitivity the fully recovered rod cell can achieve. The room, at that point, will be read at the maximum resolution the rod cells provide, coarse without color, present as shape and gradient rather than detail. That limit has not been reached yet. In the dark room, the threshold is still moving downward. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. When night falls, the archive remains.